we have Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek. Did that go well?
Very well.
who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Lodz. She is a utilitarian with a hedonistic twist, and she doesn't lift only thoughts but also weights, I heard yesterday. So she's a weightlifter in many senses of the word. She has written many books and papers together with Peter Singer, and you have a podcast now, so anybody interested in their thoughts should have a listen to the podcast. What was the name of the podcast?
Lives Well Lived.
Yes. And then last we have Markus Gabriel. He is the director of the International Center for Philosophy at the University of Bonn. He has written a number of popular books both in English and German. And he likes Iris Murdoch, I heard yesterday, which is a great thing. I appreciate that. Okay, so we have a great panel here, and I would first like to ask Katarzyna. Let's get straight to the point now with the hedonistic ideas that you have. I'm intrigued, and many here obviously are also, about hedonism. You are in favor of philosophical hedonism. Can you describe how that influences your thinking on the meaning of life?
So when I think of the meaning of life, I think of values. What is of value to us? And I'm really lucky, luckier than many other philosophers, because I can actually show you what's my meaning of life. And in order to do that, I will ask you to participate in a little game. So if you would be so kind and take a minute to think of a pleasure that you remember. Think of it now. You should see each other. You are smiling. And why are you smiling? Because if you think carefully enough about your memory of pleasure, you start feeling it. You start experiencing it. It's an absolutely gorgeous phenomenon that we are able to produce in ourselves a feeling of pleasure just by our thought. So what is the experience? Of course, if you thought about, sex, great food, gala, yesterday's gala maybe, then the feeling was not that intense, but it's still there. And now, as a philosopher, I try to define this experience that we all know. You don't need a philosopher, right, to describe you what the pleasure is. I don't think any of you had any problems in finding in your memory a pleasurable experience. I take it as a feeling, so that's this experience that you felt, that at the moment of experiencing it, you find it, you think of it as desirable, as worthy of your action, of your work, of your attitude. That's pleasure. So my definition of pleasure is quite wild. It's not narrow, yes? And that gives me possibility to say that the meaning of life for me is working on and taking care of certain mental states. So the meaning of life, like for Stoics, is not outside. These are not the goods, the things that I can buy, that I can get. But what I experience within me. Yeah, so it's this special mental state that at the moment of experiencing it, I think of it as worthy, as desirable. And that's taken from my and Peter's favorite philosopher, Henry Sidgwick, a Victorian British utilitarian. That's how he defined pleasure. So, in a way, I hope we are all hedonists. If you understand pleasure as I do, that it's not all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, although surely it is about sex and rock and roll, but not only or not mainly even, then it's quite easy to pull people towards hedonism and meaning of life as having those wonderful experiences. And then the other side of it, of course, as a utilitarian, it is to have as little as possible those experiences that are undesirable, and that means painful. And I won't ask you to remember any painful experience, but we all know that they come sometimes on their own, and somehow, especially when we lie in bed at night and can't sleep, right? We all know that we can suffer just in our mind. So a hedonist like me wants to train our brain in a way that we think of pleasure much more often than we worry about things.
Thank you, Katarzyna. That was a beautiful start. How would you answer the criticism that we can also find meaningfulness in things that are quite unpleasurable, that causes stress and anguish and suffering? We've heard about dissidents and activists here, and often an activist life is quite chronically stressful and filled with challenges and even fear, sometimes imprisonment. So you don't get enjoyment as such from it. But still there's a lot of meaningfulness involved. And this is the old Greek philosopher's differentiation between meaningful, virtuous life and the purely pleasurable life. So how would you answer this sort of criticism?
Of course, I still believe that pleasurable life is a virtuous life. But there is a sense in which we want to make sense out of suffering. And that's very human-like. Yes, we all suffer. Bad things happen to us. And we are creatures that reason and that wants to find the purpose of our suffering. So purposeless suffering is just awful. That's, I believe, we create stories. Also, religion plays that role of explaining why we suffer and why, for example, we don't do justice here. Yes, that's why we want the idea of justice after our death, for example. But I would be very careful to use pain and suffering as aim in itself of something meaningful and good. As I say, I do believe it's normal that we suffer. We are animals that feel also pain, but it doesn't justify the suffering itself. We can turn the suffering into something good, and that often we do that. Yes, when we see someone harmed, someone suffering, we want to do something about that, and that's a wonderful part of our nature that gets us to many good things. But I think I would do very well, and also as a utilitarian and maximizer of goods of others, without some suffering on my side. And one more point that I want to make is that how we suffer and how we feel pleasure depends not only on our will, but also on how we are constituted by nature. Whether we are pessimists or optimists go with genes. Then we are influenced heavily by the way we have been raised by our parents in community. So those are things that influence us, and it's not that activists are only people that suffer or feel stress. I know someone who knows all about the bad world, but is one of the most positive people on earth.
So with that, let's get to you, Peter. So philosophers are often floating on the theoretical level, detached from the personal and the private realm. We rarely speak about ourselves on the private level. But can you tell us what is your personal meaning of life and how has it changed throughout your lifetime?
Thank you. Yes, well, I mean, like Kasia, I'm also philosophically a utilitarian, and well, I did for a while hold a different variant of utilitarianism when working with Kasia on a book that we wrote about the philosopher she mentioned, Henry Sidgwick, a book called The Point of View of the Universe. I was persuaded that actually the hedonistic view was better justified, more defensible than the one that I had held. So philosophically, I agree with really what Kasia just said. But if you're asking me about personally how do I find meaning in life, it's the unfortunate fact that even though I'm able to live a good life, fortunate to be born in Australia, which is an affluent society and has lots of opportunities for people, and don't have to be a political dissident in Australia. I mean, you can disagree with what the government does, but nobody is going to put you in prison for doing that. But there are a lot of people in the world who are obviously not so fortunate. There are 700 million people in extreme poverty, as the World Bank defines it, who can't really be sure that they will be able to feed themselves and their family from one day or 1 month to the next. There are also, of course, a vast amount of suffering of non-human animals, particularly in factory farms. We're talking about hundreds of billions of vertebrate animals suffering. And these and other things are things that I've spent a lot of my life trying to alert people to these situations and to indicate that they are something that we can do something about and that we're able to do something and that we should. So, and I think in a way that has contributed to answer your specific question, not only to me finding my life and work meaningful, which I do, because I feel it can make a difference, doesn't always, but it does in some ways make a difference, but also actually making it personally rewarding. I take satisfaction out of it. It makes me want to get up in the morning and do some things. It means that, yes, in some sense it's work, but it's work that I want to do because I can see the point of doing it. And so for me at least, that answers one of the questions that one might say about what Kasia just said, and that is the Greeks had this idea of the paradox of hedonism. That is, that if you directly aim at your own pleasure, you are less likely to find it than if you aim at something that is not itself pleasure, but brings pleasure in terms of doing it. And that could vary a lot. I mean, it needn't be campaigning for human rights and trying to help dissidents. It might be trying to hit a small ball around a large course in the fewest number of strokes, right? And for some people that gives them pleasure, but they're not in a sense directly aiming at pleasure. So I think we need to find activities that give us pleasure. But for me at least, those activities are the ones that I feel are contributing to a worthwhile end. And obviously from the hedonistic utilitarian standpoint, a worthwhile end is one in which we increase happiness, increase net happiness, which very often will be most effectively done by reducing suffering. And there's a whole movement that sprung up in the last 15 years or so called the effective altruism movement, which is really people trying to do this. People who are saying, well, yes, this is an important thing for me to do. Maybe it's not the only important thing for them to do. It's not that they're saints dedicating every moment of their lives to effectively helping others, but that is an important part of their life. And the effective part of it is they are looking for and exchanging ideas online about getting research on how can you do that most effectively for whatever resources you have available, which might be some money that you can donate, it might be some particular skills that you have that you can use to benefit things. And I think, I've encountered through my life working for these causes, whether for humans in poverty or animals or generally in the effective altruism movement, I've encountered many people who do find that a rewarding and satisfying thing to do, and so indirectly achieve satisfaction, fulfillment and meaning, if you like, for themselves, while contributing to reducing the suffering of others.
Thank you. That was an excellent answer as well. So I'm going to ask the same question that as I addressed to Katarzyna. What if the worthwhile goals and values that you are striving towards cause you anguish? And again, I'm here referring to, for instance, the dissidents and activists. But also, if we talk about utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's idea that he would rather be the unhappy Socrates rather than the happy pig. This is not for me as a vegan and animal rights person, for you perhaps this is not an appropriate metaphor because pigs are probably quite wise. But how would you answer that criticism that we might have very meaningful lives which still are non-hedonistic, that are filled with also unhappiness and stress? Because if you know about the climate crisis, if you know about animal suffering, if you know about human suffering, it's quite difficult to float around in a very happy state of mind. But still you might find great meaning in trying to achieve those worthwhile ideas.
Yes, I think that's true. And I know many people, again, perhaps particularly in the animal movement, on the podcast that Kasia and I did very early on, we interviewed Ingrid Newkirk, who is the founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, maybe the largest radical animal rights organization in the world. And so she has spent, she founded it in the early 1980s, and so she has spent 45 years of her life really dwelling on the terrible things that people do to animals, that the investigators for PETA report on, from extremely painful experiments that are done on animals that are not necessary or life-saving for humans, to again factory farming and to various other forms of cruelty. And yet she's in a way a positive, cheerful person, right? I think you would agree. The interview isn't all black and bleak. It has humorous moments in it. She starts off with Ingrid hanging herself naked from a meat hook in Smithfield Market as a sort of protest against the way that she was hanging alongside equally naked corpses of pigs. The difference was that she was alive, and she describes the meat field, the news having got around the market among the meat workers, and the meat workers, coming together to see this and being rather disappointed that it was a 70-year-old woman rather than a younger woman. So I think she, feels that she has achieved things in her life, and obviously she has, and that gives her a kind of fulfillment. So, Kasia said she takes hedonism in a wide sense, not a narrow sense, and I think that can mean the satisfaction that you get from feeling that you've used your life well and you've done some good and you've reduced some suffering that was going on can be enough, and I think that's probably the case for me as well.
Absolutely, especially that we are utilitarians, and that means that we care for others, not only or not mainly again for ourselves, which Which is a good point to say that hedonism is not egoism. It's a mistake to treat that philosophical idea as equal.
But there is also hedonistic egoism and
There is.
egoistic
Yeah,
hedonism.
yeah,
But
but-
you are not on that side.
No.
Yeah. So Markus, I will get to the deep point now with you.
Oh, wow.
And this is
You were a German
one of those
philosopher.
I'm a German philosopher. Look, it says I'm a German philosopher, so I better have something.
But this is
decent.
not about Heidegger or Hegel. This is all
No, they are bad
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Like,
But
don't give me Nazi
this is
philosophers
about
there.
you, Markus, now. And this is one of those questions that perhaps might be uncomfortable to some, but something that we need to think about in general. I hope you don't lose your will to live now that I ask this. What makes you want to live rather than die?
Yeah. Well, I do believe so, and this is related to this question. I think that there really is a meaning and purpose of life, in particular human life, but not exclusively, of course. And I think the meaning and purpose of human life, and that's then part of the answer, is that, we are capable of doing the morally good and getting better at it. We are the only known animals who are capable of moral progress. We are historical beings of a particular type, and we are capable of doing better. We can identify the morally good and then do better, right? So a lot of the work by Peter, he has written a very important book on moral progress, The Expanding Circle, which I recommend there. The thought is basically, right, I mean, you start with, insight into what's morally good and then expand it, right? So if suffering of a particular type is bad for humans, because we're animals of a particular type, then it's also bad for, say, pigs, right? So, and then that's already moral progress if you think this, right? So basically my answer is that, regardless of whether there's an additional reason for this reason, there's a reason of our existence. Recently, Colin Mayer, he's a, surprisingly professor of at the business school in Oxford. He has written a wonderful book. You wouldn't expect that this is the claim. It's called Capitalism and Crises, How to Fix Them, in which he argues that there's a moral law which structures the meaning of human life. He even calls it the reason for our existence. And he identifies the moral law as the, helping others to help others to help others, etc., in a potentially infinite chain of mutual cooperation. And I think that is the reason and purpose for our existence. And I do believe that, we are capable, humans have this capability of identifying the morally good and then implementing it. Hence, we have duties towards everything over which we have power. It's an old Buddhist thought. It runs from Buddhism to Hans Jonas and beyond. So I think that having power over something, and humans are the most powerful animals we know, having power over something is having responsibility towards that over which you have power, right? So we often think that power means the capacity to dominate. It's the opposite. Power is the capacity to do good to those over which you have it. And I think that's the meaning and purpose of life. So, I'd rather live because I have a chance of contributing to moral progress. And I believe every individual has that chance wherever they are. So contributing to moral progress can mean, be nicer. You run a little sweatshop and you're just nicer to your customers, right? Or you run like a local bank and, and you do whatever is the morally appropriate thing to do. And in every human position and in every situation, humans have that capability. There might be a higher reason for that existence, but you don't need that assumption. So what I've said can go through without any religion, but I think religion at its best is also about that. So that's why I think I'd rather live than die, because I can contribute to increasing the amount of goodness in the universe.
Wow, that was a powerful argument. How does that relate to Platonic ideals and Aristotelian ideals about cultivation of virtue? Do you go back to that tradition, or perhaps you mentioned Buddhism?
Yeah.
And the strive towards eliminating suffering through questioning your primesium selfhood. Do you, I mean, here Iris Murdoch becomes relevant as well.
Oh, absolutely. So like in all traditions, so I think the, so-called European philosophical traditions have contributed to that. In particular, obviously, you mentioned many of the thinkers who already mentioned, but in many respects, philosophies from the African continent or philosophies from Asia, etc., like to describe regions, are in a certain sense often better at it because practice has already built into it, right? I mean, the Greeks too, they were all big statesmen. We must not forget that Alexander was basically Aristotle was the advisor to Alexander the Great, right? So, we must not forget that these were not people in the ivory tower in any way. The Platonic Academy, which the birthplace of what we call academia, Plato called it this way, after a place in Athens called the Academy, right, dedicated to a god. And so this is where it was located. And so like they were doing, they were trying to improve the world, but even more so with lots of, philosophical thinking outside of it, the Egyptian tradition, but also what we now call sub-Sahara Africa, Ubuntu stuff is becoming a bit more popular, but there's way more there. Right, so like I don't particularly ground what I say in those traditions, but in a wide sense, I'm a Neoplatonist. So like I think Plato got this fundamentally right. The idea he got right. I mean, he also coined the term idea, so we owe him a bit. He's the ideas man number one, and he had a really good idea, right? He calls the idea of the good. And Iris Murdoch, who I highly recommend, also just as a novelist, but beyond that, what an amazing philosopher. There are things I disagree with, it's too individualistic, whatever, but she has written a beautiful book called The Sovereignty of the Good, in which I think she plausibly argues that modern moral philosophy in the Kantian tradition is a repugnant movement because they are trying to reduce the good to self-determination of the will, right? So the modern idea is that, and I think it's a wrong idea, the modern idea is that the universe is in itself meaningless, meaning comes into being with meaning-seeking creatures, right? Mountains have no meaning. Once you have meaning-seeking creatures, they enjoy or do not enjoy mountains. I think mountains have moral values as mountains. I would go as far, that's something I learned in Japan. I work a lot with Japanese philosophers, and they think of mountains as alive. So they think that the environmental ethics is like exactly like animal ethics, just that they are very slow animals, right? And I think, and at first, of course, this is something that never occurred to me, right? I was very resistant for almost a decade dealing with Japanese thinkers, right? And then the usual Euro stuff, it's like, oh, this is animism. But now I'm convinced, right? The Japanese convinced me that they got that right. Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned mountains because there's a interesting idea in Zen Buddhism, mentioned also by Iris Murdoch, that if we want to question this individualistic Western philosophy, we can try and walk with the mountains rather than towards the mountains. So they become agents in their own right. Well, this is a really good conversation, wouldn't you think? So let's get back to Peter now. How has, and you are now the wise man, the oracle that we are asking this question, how has meaning of life changed in history of Western philosophy or world philosophies? And what could we learn from that change?
Well, one historical change, I think, it's interesting that we have all answered this in terms of what meaning do we find in our lives. We have not interpreted the question as the meaning of life. In other words, why does life exist on this planet? And one of the standard answers to that, of course, is it was part of a divine plan. There is a providence that created it in order to, whatever, lead to immortal souls who will be with God forever in eternity. And so a lot of people, when they discuss the meaning of life historically, did try to discuss that question. And then various problems occur, like, well, if God is all powerful and all good, why is there suffering on earth? So I think we've just assumed, and it's indicative of the age that we live in, though of course you could have got other people around today as well who might have interpreted it in a more theological fashion. Maybe the Archbishop who was speaking yesterday as a representative of Pope Francis might have. But that's one shift, I think, towards trying to understand this in a secular way and not within some sort of story about why are we here, what's the purpose of that, and I think that's right, because I think the answer to that larger question is it just happened. This is just actually Bill Clinton talked about this idea yesterday about the billion galaxies in the universe, and maybe there's a billion planets in each galaxy, so there are vast numbers of planets out there, and we just happen to be on this one which in which life emerged, and that's one view, and in fact that's probably the view that I hold, that there isn't any kind of reason for it. It just happened. There was a kind of a random combination of molecules, and some which started to replicate, and then they replicated, and more successful ones replicated if they had some kind of awareness of their circumstances and environment, and then developed consciousness as emerging out of that. And again, we've had some interesting guests on our podcast who talk about this. Antonio Damasio talks about this idea of consciousness emerging from a sense of your body, of your physicality, and being aware of that before we actually come to the more intellectual kind of consciousness that we have. And somewhat surprisingly, a rather different view was put forward by Thomas Nagel in an interview that we just did. Thomas Nagel is an important Western philosopher for those who are not philosophers here. And we haven't actually released this yet, but it will be released in a couple of weeks, in which he talks about the idea that so Nagel is famous for this article about what is it like to be a bat, and his answer is we can't know what it's like to be a bat. We can't know what it is to live in a world where echolocation is our major way of understanding the world around us. And the subjective experiences of consciousness is something that we cannot simply reduce to material phenomena. And then we pushed him on this, and he has a somewhat more recent book, not that recent, 10 years or so old, called Mind and Cosmos, in which he's actually questioning what the standard Darwinian sort of physicalist account that I just gave, that there was this random movement of molecules in the primeval soup that led to life emerging. And
a certain German philosopher did a postdoc with him as he was writing the book, which might explain a couple of references in that one.
Oh, really?
I might know where some of this is coming from, Peter.
This is yourself?
Yeah. Magic. Page 47, the Schelling-Hegel reference is there for a reason. We met every Friday in his office and talked this through, hence the surprising twists and turns and move towards objective idealism. Yeah, that was me.
You see? Great.
That's why the book is like, it's a surprising maneuver. It wasn't the critique of Darwin, that's him. But the German idealism stuff, that's came from me. Yeah.
So yes, okay.
Yeah. That's just a footnote, but given that we're talking about
that's
Tom.
a very interesting footnote too. But in a sense, he thinks that somehow there's life in the universe in some way before this, or there's some mind, there's some consciousness. And he's not a theist, by the way. He denies being a theist.
Mm-hmm.
But in some sense, that consciousness, that the universe isn't just physical objects. It's consciousness there from the beginning, if you like. So make of that what you can.
And if you had to pick a world tradition that has intrigued you the most when it comes to this question, what would that be?
Well, apart from the sort of standard Western view that I was educated in and still largely hold, Markus mentioned Buddhism, and for many years when I started getting interested in animals and developed views about the ethics of our treatment of animals, people would say, "Oh, are you a Buddhist, or did you get that from Buddhism?" And I really didn't get it from Buddhism. I didn't know much at all about Buddhism at the time that I wrote Animal Liberation, but that made me more interested in it and looking at the parallels. And some years ago, quite a few years now, I got invited to a conference in Taiwan of an animal organization there. And it turned out that organization was founded by a female Buddhist monastic called Chi Chao Wei. And we spent a bit of time talking about various things. And eventually I thought it would be interesting to have a dialogue with her that we recorded and wrote down, where we explore both the convergences and the differences between my secular utilitarian view and her Buddhist view. And that was published the end of 23. It's called The Buddhist and the Ethicist. And I do find that an intriguing tradition. And in particular, sort of her view was, there are some things that I just couldn't really believe, and that is that we are reincarnated into animals or other life forms. And she said, well, these are things that some Buddhists believe, but they're not the core of Buddhism, and there are other things for which we have more rational arguments or evidence for, and reincarnation is not necessarily one of those things. So I do find that an alternative, interesting tradition. And of course, there is a lot of emphasis on reducing suffering or eliminating suffering.
So back to you, Katarzyna. You said yesterday that you are an optimist, which is a relieving idea in this era of crisis. I know that many people are quite anxious about the prospect of political conflicts in Europe and decline in democracy and so forth, but also the climate crisis, animal industries which are causing tremendous suffering to non-human beings, and human rights violations all around the globe, loss of species. This is an anthropogenic era of crisis and catastrophes. So how, as an optimist, do you find meaning in this sort of an era filled with crises?
So first of all, when you're an optimist, you have no other choice, right? I mean, if that's my nature, and I do believe that there is someone in everyone's nature that's a core, yes, and either you can cultivate it or you can try to diminish it. As an optimist, as a born optimist, so for example, Jonathan Haidt believes that optimists have their frontal cortex, the left part, well developed. Yes, so you can see it on fMRI. So let's say that I am that kind of born optimist. I often feel quite a lot of power and energy to be for others. Yes, so to help others, to communicate, to give my ideas. One of the things that I do believe is that my meaning of life comes from lecturing about happiness, pleasure, good life. I teach my students. I love teaching. So that's what I do to them as well. I try to take care of them, urge them to see a therapist, see a psychiatrist if they have depression. That the way we care for ourselves is the first step to do something good to the world. Yes, I mean, if you are torn apart, if you feel depressed, if you feel that your energy is really low, then what can you give to the world constantly? Yes, you will surely quickly be so tired and so down. So you first have to take care of yourself, and not first as a first step, of course, because we are beings that are with other people all the time. But in this way, I think it's easier for an optimist to do something good to the world. What was the other question? The other part?
The era of crisis. So how do you find it difficult to be an optimist now?
So I was born in 1975 in Poland, which was a communist country at that time. In 1981, we have a real crisis in Poland. What do you call it?
Law.
Martial law, right. And I remember, I had tanks on the streets. I couldn't go to school. So I've lived quite a lot of crises so far. And I had grandma, 102, who remembers Second World War very well. And she told me all the stories. So in a way, I don't believe that we are in a special era of crisis. There are crises from time to time. There's up and downs. Perhaps with AI, we are going somewhere really, really deep. That is possible, but we are not there yet, surely. So in a way, throughout the history of humans, there have been so many wars, so many bad things happen to us that I can't see it any worse than it was. So in a way, I'm close to Steven Pinker, and we had him on our podcast as well. That we actually are getting better. I mean, believe it or not, the data shows that we are living longer, that we kill each other less, then we die from diseases less, and so on and so forth. So the data is on the positive side.
That is an optimistic way of looking at things.
I think these are facts. Actually, yeah. I do believe these are facts.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned artificial intelligence. So, Markus, my question to you is, how do you think that technological advancements and artificial intelligence will influence our understanding of the meaning of life? For instance, if we do live up to be 200 years old, or if we do get a self-conscious AI, which I think from the perspective of philosophy, that is impossible. But if that was to happen, how does that influence us? And already now, social media algorithms and so forth, how do they influence us?
Well, I think, like given what I said earlier, right? There's a big debate everywhere in different ways about the ethics of AI. Europe is trotting the, I think, misguided path of mere regulation. This is not an argument against regulation, okay? You're not going to hear a Doge argument here, but I think this is not effective. So the question is, like what kind of ethics of AI do we need in order to solve some of the philosophical puzzles, such as the value alignment problem, which, like is known from, everybody here in the room has thought in one way or another about automated driving, right? And then famously the question is who's responsible, etc., and how can the car make a decision, and those kinds of questions, right? So all of this is largely unsolved, and it's just beginning research on this. There's literature, but we don't. But I've developed a particular take on this, which I don't call the ethics of AI, but ethical AI. And so ethical AI is the idea that we have to design systems that serve primarily a moral function. Such as, so imagine like I'm working right now designing a system which you can soon use if you want. It will be called Alpha Buddha. I'm designing this with a Buddhist monk, Shokei Matsumoto, who's head of 2 big temples in Tokyo. And so what Alpha Buddha, there are 3 uses of it. Alpha Buddha's first use, for instance, is, the programmer programmed the fatigue detection system in cars, which right? Stop, drink a coffee, this was done at Volkswagen. And so, like, imagine you have a system that tells you, to be more coherent. It reduces noise, as Kahneman used to call it, right? So, it tells you, no, actually, you wanted to call your daughter, right? And then Alpha Buddha calls you. It's like, you wanted to call your daughter. It's like, yeah, okay, damn. So that's just measuring coherence in your behavior, right? And then, but that's the lowest level. And then there are higher versions. The higher level we call a plutonium, the plutonium version, like which optimizes you morally, right? The system studies your moral judgment, right? And then detects patterns in your own judgment. We know AI systems are very good at pattern detection. So that's known, right? No speculation needed. Now imagine you use AI systems to study human value judgment large scale. I think this would be the first actual, fully scientific data-driven grip on the anthropology of value. There's research starting in 2019 which has shown quite clearly that humans have universally shared values. No, there's no human culture which desires to throw children out of the window. Oh, well, let's do that, right? So not even Putin does that. And, not for all children, at least, like,
Yes, exactly.
you see, but there's evil. But now imagine that we use AI systems, and that's the thought, right, as engines of moral progress. There's no reason not to do this. So the ethics of AI discussion is typically what I call an opposition ethics. And I'm against opposition ethics. I'm for the opposition, but sometimes, depending on... But opposition ethics is the idea that bad things are happening, Elon Musk, whatever, and now we got to regulate him down, right? So I think that's opposition ethics. I want ethics to be at the center of human activity. So I think ethical AI would consist in us building ethical systems rather than regulating evil systems. Most AI systems which are currently in usage, right, the majority out there is bad, it's evil stuff. But then how to solve this, not by regulating or opposition ethics, but designing better systems. That's my take. I think indeed AI is the biggest risk we have seen to humanity, I believe. And so much more urgent it is to go in. That's currently my view on this.
But I
Thank
like
you.
it.
Yeah, go on.
I'm thinking of a system, you go to a restaurant and your telephone tells you, you are not going to order meat. You are not going to order meat.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the system gives you information about this, right? I mean, so lately, like everybody now that climate has moved, like now we're obsessed with other things, and it looks like climate is not even a topic anymore. And, so it's good to forget this for a while, to just okay, glad, I'm forgetting this at least a little bit. And then my 10-year-old daughter, who's like my ethical, not AI, but my ethical I. And so she's like, Daddy, did you know that every 11 minutes a soccer field is destroyed in the rainforest? It's like, damn, don't remind me, but that's the alpha Buddha function. Right, and she, I have this debate every morning, like meat when she sees whatever, but yeah, so that's exactly what the alpha. But that would be the plutonium level, right? So the lowest level just tells you, you're a vegan, don't eat meat, and you say, okay, no fish, nothing. And the highest level tells Donald Trump when he's about to order the next burger with a Coke, don't, Donald, don't. I mean, he won't use alpha Buddha, I'm sure, but anyhow, yeah, absolutely. That's what the system could do.
But can I? So that is exactly what the problem is, isn't it? What you just said, that Donald Trump won't use Alpha Buddha, but also more importantly, the people who are designing the AI, let's say Meta is designing its algorithms, it doesn't want to get you to do the ethical thing. It wants you to keep clicking, exactly. Because that's how it makes money. Yeah. So you said something negative about European regulation, but if you don't have regulation, how are you going to stop people just doing whatever will make the companies more money?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that I think it's not effective. I think the fact that they seized the American government is, and that they're going for Europe particularly, right, might trigger, more conflict situations. So I think, I think regulation won't do it. We might need it. I mean, it might do it. But I think the more ambitious aim would be to design systems that are, we need to change the business model. Of course, if if European regulation could get a significant hold, maybe, maybe the market, given that European regulation will be in a global market. But I think that the US would rather wage war against the European Union than let us create effective regulation. That's my worry. So that's really a very concrete worry. Because I'm absolutely not against regulation, but then the problem is going to be, there we need to look at the legal infrastructure of the business case. We all love Bill Clinton, but Bill Clinton, I think it was in his time that the platforms were classified as platforms, right? And I always thought that this was his biggest political mistake, and we are dealing with that. So the mistake happened there, and it wasn't the Republicans. It was a plausible mistake. I fully understand it was at the beginning, right? But those kinds of things, these are heavy-duty, complex, indeed, legal questions. But the business case is nefarious. The current business case, large-scale business case for artificial intelligence, we heard Kate Crawford yesterday, talking about the climate. The current business case is just evil.
This is such a good conversation. But let's get back to the meaning of life briefly. And I want all of you to line out in very simple terms for the non-philosophers here, so not using any technical jargon, your idea of what is the meaning of life. And let me start with a very kind of sketchy definition myself, or my approach to meaning of life. I love Iris Murdoch and Buddhism, and I think that we should try and develop our attention towards the inner realities of other creatures and the reality of mountains or forests or oceans, the spectacular diversity of life on this planet, and then try and do good, sustain life and minimize suffering, and that's it. But what are your whether minimize suffering for human or non-human animals, or for sustaining life in the human or non-human environment? So all of life is included. But what are your definitions? Let's start with Peter. If you were to have to explain the meaning of life, a very simple question in 4 sentences, how would it go?
I would focus on sentient beings, that is, conscious beings. I haven't accepted the mountains as yet. That's another issue. But so I would focus on the meaning of life is for sentient beings to have the most positive forms of consciousness experiences and the fewest negative ones. I think that's only 2 sentences.
Wow, that was beautiful. Katarzyna?
I think the meaning of life is to be good for each other, to take care, to love, to work on peace, all of that thing that you would hear from other people. We are very simple. I think we are very simple and common. It's difficult, and I still remember our conversation yesterday. I mean, not ours, but the conversation that the former Prime Minister of Israel had in the morning. Have you seen it? Have you been there? I thought it was really devastating because it started with those wonderful words, ideas, and then it all collapsed at the end. And that's how we are. We can do good and we can do bad. So I completely agree with you, Markus, that our aim and our purpose and our meaning is to do better constantly and work.
And Markus?
Well, I typically say the meaning of life is the good life, and the good life is life dedicated to the good, right? And then you see how the two hang together, because the good is, dedicating your life primarily, right, to improving the life of all life. And then, the methods developed by Peter and Kasia are ways of doing that, right? So I'm not an, utilitarian, nor am I a hedonist, but these are great methods. So I think we should use all methods that are available to us, philosophical and otherwise, right, rather than bet on one single ethical system to see the best, what we can do with it. But, as short as I can, the meaning of life is the good life, and the good life is the life dedicated to the good of oneself and others.
Oh, such brilliant answers. This conversation could carry on for many more hours, I'm sure. We started a few minutes late, so I hope that we can continue a few minutes over time. Do you have any criticism for each other or any questions that you want to, being philosophers, that now is the time to argue?
I think we've agreed like no other philosophers do.
Look, we can go into the narcissism of petty details, and argue about details, why I'm not a hedonist, etc. But I think also maybe that's something that people here agree about. It matters more, right, that we share this vision, and then this disagreement also among philosophers. For me, is we're talking about tools, right? So we have these tools. And then we look at, whether these tools are actually effective in practice. And this is how I would generally measure a view in ethics. Because ethics is practical cognition. So it matters what you do more than what you say.
Having done philosophy for 25 years, this is the first time I'm with a group of philosophers who don't start to argue amongst themselves. So this is something else. Does the audience have any questions? Yes.
So I'll jump in and disagree.
Again.
Meaning is a human construct. You guys alluded to that. I don't know if there's any disagreement on that, but it seems fairly straightforward. So when we look to interpreting meaning in different ways in different cultures, I like the Taoist philosophy of be the river, right? And so how do I interpret that? I interpret that as be your DNA, be who you are, right? And so the river is individual. It's for each person. We all have different rivers, right? And so as a realist, or I don't know the terms, but as a person who believes that we are our DNA, then I open up the question of, but what if your river isn't good? I think that there's an empathy spectrum, and some folks are on the very end of that spectrum where they have almost no empathy. Serial killers, Putin, Trump, Netanyahu, etc. So what if their river is no empathy at all? Just me.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Sapolsky, determined, on our podcast. Sorry for that. But he exactly believes that we are very, very narrowed in what we actually can do and what depends on our will. I mean, he believes that nothing depends on our will. It's all about genes, upbringing, hormones, our interactions that influence. And he believes that in this way we shouldn't judge, and morality as such has no sense. It has meaning only because we put the meaning into it to be able to live together, and for example to tell someone to praise or to blame, and that's like a tool to get together. But in the deep meaning of morality, of goodness and badness, he at least believes that there is nothing in it. Yes, we are all animals run by biology and culture.
Good. I'm glad there's finally deep disagreement.
I mean, it's not that I believe that.
Good. Yeah.
No. It's Sapolsky does. Yeah.
But maybe words, so great also the river, so let's start there. And I think that you ran like a really good thought. The idea of like destiny, that's destiny idea that you find in Taoism, and Heraclitus is the guy to go to in the West. I was just at a conference with sinologists from Taiwan, very interesting. We looked very closely at the Lao Tzu, in particular chapter 40 and chapter 2, amazing stuff about all of this. And then, interestingly, this seems to have swept over into Greek philosophy, and Heraclitus is the go-to person, and he has a view of this form. It's not river in this case, but fire, but similar. Now, but I think you towards the end of the way in which you put your question, it became clear that we then need this extra notion, right? So we have this notion of be your destiny, right? I think that's really an important one about meaning. But then, as you said, there are bad and good rivers. And I think this is where ethics comes in, right? So it's not enough to say, right, Hitler followed his destiny. Well, he might, but then this was evil destiny, right? So indeed, goodness cannot be just follow your destiny, right? Goodness needs to be, follow your destiny and find the good, right? Because I do believe in free will. I think free will is the capacity precisely of good and evil. And the capacity is there because we're not a bunch of neurons. This has also never been demonstrated, but that would be a long philosophy of mind discussion. But I do think indeed that we have an option to judge each other, but then the judging must not be moralism, right? Because, we are fallible in ethics. I think of ethics generally as a fallible scientific discipline. So I might get something wrong about the actual quality of the behavior of others. But that's maybe then a little disagreement. I don't think that meaning is a human construct. I think meaning is built into the fabric of the universe, and we are there to detect it.
Okay, thank you, Markus. And then
but that's a longer discussion.
Yeah, that's a longer discussion. We have such a few seconds left, but I think your hand was first.
Yeah, I was a question about the optimism. I was reading recently this book from Ulsan, the South Korean philosopher, The Spirit of Hope, that makes an interesting definition of optimism and being hopeful in times of crisis. And he relates that to individualism and collective agency. I just wanted to know if you had any of your reactions about that, and that optimism it's more passive, and being hopeful drives more action and collective action. I was very intrigued by that argument. So.
It seems to me now when you're speaking that it might be a matter of definition, right? I mean, what you do with the attitude. So optimism is a kind of attitude toward the world, what happens to you and others, yes? And hope, I'm sure, is a crucial element to that. I understand that hope goes with action more. Yes, that's what you mean. But that, also, of course, also goes with motivation and how you are motivated to act and be towards others, for example. I don't know whether any of you want to add?
Just one thing, I don't know how, I didn't check how to best translate this into English. It might just be optimism in English as a colloquial term. So in German you can draw a distinction between hope, Hoffnung, and Zuversicht. And Zuversicht is like a practical type of hope, right? Hope could be, let's hope that things, hope could be a type of bet that you place. Maybe, because your cortex has a structure, say, whatever the reason is that, you're more hopeful. And the German term Zuversicht is like a practical version of it.
You would say faith.
Yeah.
In translation.
Yeah, you would say, okay, yeah,
faith.
Where, you really believe. So the idea,
if you're saying, have faith in acting.
But
this would be too.
But faith to me suggests something that isn't rationally based, or isn't based on evidence.
Yes, and this is totally evidence based. So imagine you look at something, some heavy duty, contested like political or business action, right? And then Zuversicht would be you see that this is the right path, right? Whilst others disagree with you, many might think you're crazy, etc., right? But you follow that light, and it's evidence-based, it's rational, you did your research, right? It's based on all of this, right? That would be this note.
I'm thinking about what's the right word in German, because in German we are lacking this idea of having faith in something in the future if you're not religious, right? And recently,
it's
one of
Zuversicht
the
in
German
German.
Politicians hit on it by saying...
Oh, I wonder where this is coming from. Winfried Kretschmann started it. Habeck got it from Kretschmann at a conference in Mannheim on a panel. Yeah.
So there was one more question there, yes.
Oh, yeah. Daniel Kahneman talks about like the remembering self and, now I just blank it, like the current
Experiencing self.
Experiencing self, yeah. And do you believe that there is a conflict between that when it comes to happiness? Like, how much do you have to sacrifice short-term and long-term happiness?
Yeah, another podcast interview we did, actually, the first.
They've interviewed everybody.
Not quite. So I do think that there can be a conflict. And in fact, the conflict is that sometimes it seems that your experience was different from the way you remember it. And therefore, if you rely on your memory to say, that was a bad thing, I don't want to do it again, or that was a good thing, you may be actually wrong and you may be having a worse experience. So there is certainly that conflict, and I would say the memory is fallible and the experiencing self is really what you would want to go with if you can find it out.
Yeah, it surely is fallible, and that's a moment in which it's really important to be conscious of what's happening to you. That's why I always tell my students to keep a diary, especially when you know your nature and, for example, you know that you have pessimistic inclinations. That means that you will remember even good things happening to you afterwards in a worse way, or you will forget about them, and so on and so forth. So if you have it, if you are self-aware, keep a diary and then look back and see what has happened to you.
And that takes us to where we began, right? We can think about what happened to us and we can be smiling and experiencing the pleasure of what happened to us.
Exactly. And that's why we are going to take a photo, right? So to remember this very pleasant moment.
Definitely. So this is now the coffee break time. I realize that there's nobody coming to the room right now. So if there is a burning question, raise your hand, please. No questions.
Okay.
The gurus are sitting here.
They all want to talk.
There's one more there.
Oh, yeah.
All right, and then I'll go with my second question. A specific and general on AI. If we can't tell the consciousness of a bat, if we cannot understand the consciousness of a bat, how sure are we that AI will not have consciousness if we cannot understand it or relate to it?
Yeah.
That's a specific question. And then the broad question is, everybody keeps telling us that AI is going to kill us all. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, the short answer to the last question is it won't kill us. We will kill each other with it. That's the biggest threat, I believe.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's one view, but the people who mostly think this,
Not very optimistic,
Toby Ord,
right?
who was here yesterday, for example, actually think that that developing super intelligent AI, which is more intelligent than us, is, I say it was Nick Bostrom who said, it's a basic Darwinian error, right? Chimpanzees would have been a lot better off if there had never been a more intelligent creature on this planet than chimpanzees. There would have been many more chimpanzees than there are now. So, if we do create something smarter than us, maybe its aims and objectives will be incompatible with our continued existence. That's the thought.
On the other
I'm
hand,
not saying I accept it, but that's what
That's
people
the
say.
thought. Yeah. To which one could also reply, why would a being that's more intelligent than us not be more ethical than us?
Exactly.
Because that would be more intelligent.
That's the optimistic view.
That's the optimistic view.
That's right.
utopia.
Yeah. And then I think that a lot of depends on, right, what we think that the systems are modeling. Currently, they're modeling efficiency. So, efficiency intelligence can be defined, that's my term, as the following measure, right? A system S is more intelligent in that sense than a system S star if it solves the same problem faster by whatever means. And so we're optimizing on that. And then the question is what it does, that's why also Nick Bostrom has then these thought experiments, like the paperclip factory, that would say, if we optimize just on efficiency, that the collateral damage might also be the destruction of humanity, even though the agent has no nefarious intention.
Right.
That's another line. Yep. That's a big one.
Yeah, and as you asked about consciousness, I mean, I don't think there's any in principle reason why AI couldn't be conscious. I don't think the fact that we're made out of the biological materials that we are is necessary for consciousness if we had the right neural network. But, I think we're still very far away from that. I don't see any reason to think that ChatGPT is conscious.
Yeah. I think that a game changer would be, this is in principle possible. Some people have been thinking about this. I mean, one of the trends in AI now is, of course, neuromorphic computing. And people are going back to some of the earlier expert systems in order to repair some of the problems in the LLMs. So the research is going there, but still neuromorphic, not based on neurons. But neuromorphic might be coming closer for the reasons that Peter gave, right? But what is also possible is we could use cerebral organoids. We can already build them. San Diego is pretty good at this, for instance. So maybe this might be shut down by Trump, so this might be a good effect of it. But be that as it may, so we could, of course, begin using neural tissue to run programs on it. And then, we'd be approaching this faster. I think it would be evil to do that for all the reasons that these people here are thinking about a lot. I think these would be heavily suffering systems. Yeah, they may be conscious. But yeah, so I would also say there's no principle obstacle, but I don't think anybody who's working on it is actually doing the right thing to get there. So they are merely speculating.
Okay, so okay. Yeah, go on.
What's your best argument that we're actually living in the original reality?
Wow, the big one.
Yeah.
Who wants to? Peter, you must.
Oh yeah, I want to hear Peter say
I
guru.
don't think I have anything special to say on that. I suppose we don't know for certain. This is the new version of Descartes' demon, right? That could be causing all of this to be a dream. But I don't think that possibility makes any difference to the way we're going to live or what we're going to do. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it.
My question to you would be, would you care?
What is it, a good run, or is it a good dream, or is it a bad dream?
Yeah, it's a dream we have. right? So it's the opposite of the experience machine by Nozick, which is one of the main argument against hedonism. Yes, would we plug into a machine that would give us the best experiences ever? Well, I mean, what if we are in the machine? Yes.
Would we want to unplug? Is the question then?
Yes, and then would we want to unplug? And Kahneman shows that probably we wouldn't, because we have this status quo bias. We just like where we are, where we sit.
Yeah. Well, the best argument I know still against it, I spent like almost a decade working on this one, skepticism. Really? I spent maybe too much time on this. But the best one, I think still, it can be repaired, but here's a version, right? So you need a bunch of repair mechanisms to make this work. But it's a line which is actually the origin of the movie The Matrix. It has two philosophy inspirations. One is a book by Jean Baudrillard, Simulacre et Simulation, which is shown in the movie. Neo hides a USB stick in an empty shell of that book in his home. And you see the cover of Simulacre and Simulation. That's one inspiration. The other is a paper by the philosopher Hilary Putnam, called Brains in a Vat. It's the opening chapter of a book called Reason, Truth, and History. And they have read those two stuff, right? And Putnam does not only develop the thought experiment of the Matrix, almost like it's in the Matrix, a little different, but he also gives an argument against it, which is wonderful. So, and you find this in Wittgenstein's too. So here's the argument. So this was just a reference. If this is a dream, say an eternal dream, there are different versions. But if you're in a type of eternal dream, and you wonder whether you are in an eternal dream, then the word dream in your dream does not mean dream. So if you're in a dream, you cannot wonder whether you're in a dream. Given that you're wondering whether you're in a dream, you know you're not. And there you can repair this for almost every scenario. So I believe a version of the argument goes through.
Well, that's a relieving end note, so that we are not living in a simulation. Sometimes I do hope we were, because if I could change my simulation to something that is more sustaining of life, and there is no climate crisis and so forth, it would be a great thing. But to end here, you said about artificial intelligence becoming more intelligent and perhaps therefore ethical. Well, my counter argument would be that it doesn't have empathy because it doesn't have emotions, and empathy is necessary for moral agency. But all of you, in your descriptions of the meaning of life, gave quite empathetic descriptions, alleviation of suffering, considering others, helping others. And what a beautiful picture in this era of hate and disgust and anger and conflict and status competition. We can be empathetic creatures who find meaning in compassion and being good to one another, both human and animal others. So let's end here, and thank you for everybody for being here. Thank you for the panelists.